Okay, I'm continuing with Henry Morris's quote on the differences in the various creatures. And he, within his quote, is quoting Dr. W.R. Thompson, who's commenting on these differences which persist in the observations between organisms. And again, let me pick up part of what I already read. He said, the general tendency to eliminate by means of unverifiable speculations the limits of categories nature presents to us is the inheritance of biology from the origin of species. To establish the continuity required by theory, historical arguments are invoked, even though historical evidence is lacking. Thus are engendered those fragile towers of hypotheses based upon hypotheses, where fact and fiction intermingle in an inextricable confusion, unquote. Continuing now with Henry Morris after he finished quoting Dr. Thompson, he says, as Dr. Thompson points out, a continuity of organisms is required by the theory, but there is no evidence that it exists now or ever has existed, the continuity. The evolution model implies that all organisms have come from a common ancestor. Since they all live in a continuity of environments in the same world and have developed by the same natural processes, the primary prediction from the evolution model must be that of a continuum of organisms rather than distinct kinds separated by gaps. To explain the gaps, numerous secondary assumptions have to be introduced into the model. That's the sub-theories and sub-theories I'm talking about. He says the, quote, towers of hypotheses based on hypotheses, unquote, noted by Dr. Thompson. The creation model, Henry Morris says, once again does not have to explain the data, quote unquote, explain, by introducing such secondary assumptions. To the contrary, it predicts the data. That is, an array of distinct kinds of organisms separated by gaps with both similarities and differences. In view of the foregoing facts, it is strange that evolutionists constantly place such strong emphasis on similarities as evidence of evolution. In every case, the similarities are better explained by creation, and the differences are predicted by creation, unquote. Okay, now I've got some other comments from various people on the area of molecular biology in general. Again, the evolutionists once claimed, and some are still claiming, that research in molecular biology would yield devastating evidence against creationism. Kind of like we heard about that first night from our molecular biologist evolutionist friend who said that he sees evolution in the laboratory every day. It's an absolute, undeniable, proven fact, and anybody who denies it just doesn't know what they're talking about. So there are people like that still running around. However, in fact, the opposite has been the case. Rather than coming up with devastating evidence against creationism, the devastating evidence is against evolution. The family tree that was expected to be found in the sequences of chemical units in proteins and in DNA that the evolutionists predicted have simply not been there. Here's some statements by evolutionists. Again, I quoted from Michael Denton earlier. He's a molecular genetics researcher and a molecular biologist and a medical doctor, and he said this in his book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. Quote, the real significant finding that comes to light from comparing the proteins' amino acid sequences is that it is impossible to arrange them in any sort of an evolutionary series, unquote. Biochemistry researcher Mark Dwinell, concerning the molecular clock idea, which seeks to show evolutionary relationships between creatures, in an article he wrote called Molecular Evolution or Bust, in a magazine called Origins Research, said this: the seemingly plausible theory, however, is fraught with difficulties for the evolutionists. Any attempt to promote this theory as reasonable and valid in light of so many discrepancies seems deceptive or duplicitous, unquote. Another quote from Michael Denton, again a molecular biologist and an evolutionist. He asserts, quote, this is again from his book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, there is little doubt that if this molecular evidence had been available 1 century ago, it would have been seized upon with devastating effect by the opponents of evolution, of evolutionary theory, like name I can't pronounce, Agassiz, a biologist from Harvard who opposed Darwin. And the idea, he would be one of the guys who would grab it up and use it if it had been available. And the idea of organic evolution, he says, might never have been accepted if the information we have today had been around 100 years ago, at the time that Darwin was taking strong hold.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Each of these scientists seems to be a specialist in its field, and yet these men seem to be finding exceptions within their own science that would show that there's no evidence of evolution in that area.
Right.
So then they believe in evolution, but are they believing it because of another area that they believe to be true?
No. They believe it because, as we said at the beginning of this study, they want to believe it. But they're just honest enough. These guys, the guys I'm quoting, are guys that are serious scientists they're committed to their science, and they're not willing to give up real science to try to support their belief system. They have a belief system. They're still holding to it. They don't want to believe in creation. So therefore they don't. And again, we quoted from, and we'll be quoting again some other quotes from him a little later, we quoted from Huxley years ago, from back in the 30s, Aldous Huxley, when he admitted that the reason for choosing to believe in evolution was because it gave him moral freedom. You know, so, and the reason they preferred it was because they didn't like the implications of creation and God. Yeah.
Plus, the natural man is without God's Spirit, and therefore he is unable to spiritually discern what God says in His Word.
Mm-hmm.
And being of a natural mind, any wisdom that he thinks he possesses cannot obtain to find out God's truth.
Mm-hmm.
In and of himself, he needs God's Spirit. So
Right, that's true. Now, one other thing I want to say about it is this. I believe many of the quotes are not just saying there's no evidence within this area of our study. They're saying that, but they're also saying, and a lot of the quotes are from the same men, and they're quoting in different areas, but they're saying the evidence isn't there to support this theory of evolution. That doesn't mean they're rejecting evolution. They're just saying that what we've believed about it, been told about it, doesn't explain it, and the evidence isn't there to support it. Maybe it happened some other way. I believe it happened, but it didn't happen the way they're saying it happened, and there's no evidence to support what they're saying happened. That's what I think is what they're saying. Many have been surprised, in fact, Christians even have been surprised to discover that the evidence from almost every field of science has caused the case for evolutionism to steadily get weaker and weaker through the years. This is especially true in the last 20 to 30 years. Prior to 30 years ago, there was hardly anybody out there making any noise at all. There were individuals who knew and believed the truth, and even knew that there was science. The science was not in favor of evolution, but overall, the vast majority of people knew nothing at all until starting about 30 years ago. And in the last, especially 20 years, the debate has really heated up. And it's been a big surprise to most people, Christians and creationists as well as evolutionists. Let's look at, just in general, the overall status of so-called evolutionary science by just giving some general quotes, not in any particular field or area of attacking any particular subject matter, but just in general. I have just a series of quotes here from different scientists, most of whom, if not all of them, are evolutionists. Physicist and mathematician, I quoted from before, Wolfgang Smith. His full name is John Wolfgang Smith. In 1988, in his book that we referred to before, Teilhardism and the New Religion, a Thorough Analysis of the Teachings of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, stated his view of the present situation regarding evolution, and he said this: the salient fact is this: if by evolution we mean macroevolution, as we henceforth shall, in his book, then it can be said, this is early in the book, it's like page 5 that he said this, then it can be said with the utmost rigor that the doctrine is totally bereft of scientific sanction. Now, to be sure, given the multitude of extravagant claims about evolution promulgated by evolutionists with an air of scientific infallibility, this may indeed sound strange, what he just said. And think about the way we've been taught evolution in school. It's just been stated as a fact. Think about the way guys like Carl Sagan and these other people, that guy they interviewed on that show about the debate between creation and evolution that we talked about last week, that one scientist who made the statement that, well, if you're going to look for a flood, you'd find the evidence in the fossil records. Let's go out and look. We look and look and look. There's not evidence of a flood, a worldwide flood, anywhere at all, anywhere on the earth. And did they just state these things as absolute facts? He made the statement that there is absolutely no science of any kind behind creationism. It's all simply religious. I mean, they're just stated as facts, you know. And again, they preach this stuff with an air of scientific infallibility, as Smith said. He goes on and says, yet the fact remains, in spite of the strange-sounding statement that he made, yet the fact remains that there exists to this day not a shred of bona fide scientific evidence in support of the thesis that macroevolutionary transformations have occurred. Again, that doesn't mean he doesn't believe that they have occurred. He's saying there's simply, to date, no actual evidence that it did happen. Another quote from him from another page on his book. In his book, he said, "We are told dogmatically that evolution is an established fact, but we are never told who has established it and by what means. We are told often enough that the doctrine is founded upon evidence, and that indeed this evidence is henceforward above all verification, as well as being immune from any subsequent contradiction by experience. But we are left entirely in the dark on the crucial question wherein precisely this evidence consists." They just state that it's so. We've got the evidence. Just like, again, that first night, our microbiologist friend who just stated, I see it every day in the laboratory, it's a fact. He didn't give us anything to argue that case or to demonstrate it or to document it. Even when we asked for it, just state that it's so. And going back to Smith's comment here to enjoy every nuance of what he's actually saying here, he said again, we're told often enough that the doctrine is founded upon evidence, and indeed this evidence is henceforward, from now on, above all verification. That means nobody is allowed to challenge it and say, wait a minute, let's see if this is verifiable. It's just held to be true. We don't need to verify it. That's what he's saying. Then he says, as well as being immune from any subsequent contradiction by experience. If you find any evidence out there that contradicts it, which is now your experience contradicting it, that doesn't count. We're immune from applying that to it. We just throw those things out. We toss those. Yeah.
Kind of like when you challenge people with socialistic ideas.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, well, obvious that could be.
Yeah.
Why would you even want to think like that?
Yeah. Right. When in the area of politics, when you get and politics, it's more than politics, economics, politics, all those various areas, social interaction and governments, etc. When you discuss that with people who are not of a conservative mind frame, and you bring up the evidence, they just simply deny it, and they go by their belief rather than by the facts. And you dare not challenge it.
Their belief is based on just
Feelings and a humanistic premise. Now, by the way, let me give you John Wolfgang Smith's background. Mathematician and physicist, PhD in mathematics from Columbia University in 1957, Master of Science degree in physics from Purdue University in 1950, Bachelor of Science degree from Cornell University at age 18 in physics, philosophy, and mathematics. He got his first degree from Cornell University at age 18. That's when I started college. Currently professor of mathematics at Oregon State University, formerly an aerodynamicist with Bell Aircraft Corporation, he provided the, quote, theoretical key to the solution for the famed re-entry problem for spaceflight. You know how serious re-entry is for spaceflight? You don't just send the guys up there and go, wait a minute, how are we going to get them back? And re-entry was a big problem. He figured it out. Former math instructor at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Former assistant and associate professor at UCLA. Active research mathematician, and he's published in many and various scientific journals. This guy is no pansy out there who doesn't know what he's talking about. Here's another quote from Smith from, again, his same book. He said this: today, 128 years after it was first promulgated, this book was written in 1988, the Darwinian theory of evolution stands under attack as never before. There was a time not too long ago when it seemed to the world at large that the theory had triumphed once and for all, and the issue was henceforth closed. And yet, within the last 2 decades, the debate about evolution has not only revived, but is showing signs of heating up. Indeed, the question whether the evolutionist claims are justified is currently being discussed and argued, not just in fundamentalist circles, that's people like us, but also on occasion in research institutes and in the prestigious halls of academe. The fact is that in recent times there has been increasing dissent on the issue within academic and professional ranks, and that a growing number of respectable scientists are defecting from the evolutionist camp. It is interesting, moreover, that for the most part these experts, quote-unquote, have abandoned Darwinism not on the basis of religious faith or biblical persuasions, but on strictly scientific grounds, and in some instances regretfully, as one could say. In other words, some of the ones that have given it up and actually come to believe in scientific creationism are doing it with regret. They wish they didn't have to. They don't want to believe in creationism, but they have to believe in it because of the evidence. And they're honest enough to say what we believe doesn't hold up. We quoted earlier more than once from Michael Denton, again in his book Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. He said this: ultimately, the Darwinian theory of evolution is no more nor less than the great cosmogonic myth of the 20th century, unquote. Now, before we go on with some more quotes about the overall condition of evolution, evolutionary, quote-unquote, science and theory today, I want to look at 5 quotes from a single TV program. You've heard of Nova? Okay, that's a public television, evolutionary-oriented, typical, modern-day worldview program, right? Broadcast in October of 1988, they had a program called Do Scientists Cheat? And here are quotes that will indicate that everybody in the scientific community is not as honest as some of the men that we've been quoting. Now, these statements don't specifically relate to the issue of, or the subject of evolution, or any other specific area of science. This is just general problem in the scientific community that no TV program is addressing. But remember, they are committed to evolution, that program. Okay? But I'm just clarifying that I'm not quoting these things as if all of this has to do with evolutionary scientists working on evolution. This is just in general, science in general, but it applies across the board. Here are some of the statements. From Leon Kamen of Northeastern University, on the program he said this: if you want to impress people with how good your science is, if you want to get tenure in a modern university, that means after you've been a professor long enough, you got your job for life. If you want to get a research grant, and they all do, you can't afford, he says, to come and say, quote, well, I think this might be the case, But there are all sorts of indications here that it might not be the case, and it's all sort of confused, unquote. Don't say that. He says people always tend in science, as elsewhere, to sharpen up and clean up a story. Of course, it's not a fraud. It's just a part of the general atmosphere in which you're not actually saying to people, tell the truth, tell the whole truth, and let it all out. Okay? The underlying theme, he's saying, in the universities and in academia is if you're doing research and you want to keep your job and you want to be promoted and get tenure and all these other things, they're not encouraging you to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The system encourages you to fudge. From Dr. Dan Bruce, senior editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, on the program, he said this: it doesn't take much to take a little bit of data, change it the way you want it to look, and then publish it. And it's impossible to detect it. The narrator of this NOVA program said this: the 1980s have witnessed a flurry of scientific fraud and misconduct cases, including a number of cases as yet unresolved. On the program, Congressman John Dingell, who was chairman of the Congressional House Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, said this: after the initial inquiry by this committee into this subject, and the particular subject they were investigating was scientific fraud and misconduct in connection with scientific research, the committee has had growing reason to believe that we are only seeing the tip of a very unfortunate, dangerous, and important iceberg, unquote. And then finally, the narrator again said this of this NOVA program, Do Scientists Cheat? He said, yet one recent study has alleged science's quality control mechanism can't even be counted on to catch simple sloppiness, let alone a clever fraud, unquote. I read those quotes just to overall be reminded that scientists are really actually just people too, and they're just like everybody out there. They're sinners like anybody else. And they've got their biases, they got their agendas, and they'll do whatever they can to promote their agenda and to accomplish their ends, even if it means not being honest. Yeah.
So it was a kind of like a congressional study? Or
They did, no, it was an investigation, not just a study. And the reason for it is because Congress doles out millions and millions of dollars, which they shouldn't be doing, to research grants to these people. And there was a lot of evidence that there was fraud going on, and so they'd had an investigation. The Oversight and Investigation Committee, they basically, they have oversight over, is the money being used properly? You know, and if these people are cheating on their research results and their reports, and the government's paying for it, there's a problem. Somebody called it their attention. There was enough uproar about it, they finally had a committee hearings on it.
Bull line belching was causing a whole nose.
Right.
so you mean Congress was concerned that there was some
Budging going on.
situational
Ethics. Yeah. Oddly enough, yes. Now, of course, you know the old thing about if you don't throw stones if you live in a glass house. Well, who's investigating Congress? Yeah, that's true. But the point is, there are a few guys in Congress, they don't usually last too long, but there are a few people in Congress who will say, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? They're making enough of a fuss to call some attention to some things, and they had some hearings. Now, what came out of the hearings? Are probably giving just as much money out as ever, and nothing's probably changed. But the point is, the investigation proved that there was all kinds of stuff going on that just simply reflected a lack of integrity in the scientific community. Okay. The average person that makes up what we call the public is basically almost totally unaware of the serious scientific problems with Darwinianism and all forms of evolution. And when I say serious problems, we've been discussing these things for, about 12 weeks now. forgetting our scriptural discussion, just the science areas alone. And very clearly, there's a lot of problems. The average person out there doesn't have the remotest idea that this is true. Students have been taught evolution in school as if it were an established fact rather than just a theoretical model, as we've discussed that it ought to be, if it's going to be taught at all, just taught as a model of origins. Or else they've been taught that there's simply no alternative of any kind, no possible alternative. This is simply the only possibility. That's how it's taught as well. There are, however, many in the higher echelons of science, we've just quoted from some, and we're going to quote from some more now, that are convinced that evolutionism is not well supported by the facts. Again, that does not mean they don't believe in it. It just means they're honest enough to admit we don't have facts to back up what we're saying, so we shouldn't go around saying it's a fact. From a guy by the name of I.L. Cohen in a book called Darwin Was Wrong, A Study in Probabilities. And by the way, a lot of these books that have names with Darwin in it, and they're besmirching Darwin. Most of those people are evolutionists that have written those kind of books. They're not people that are saying because Darwin's wrong, therefore evolution isn't true at all. Evolution is a total lie and we don't believe in evolution. They're just simply saying that what has been believed about evolution is not right. Anyway, Cohen said this. This is that much of a quote. I got several different quotes out of his book here altogether. He said, any suppression which undermines and destroys that very foundation on which scientific methodology and research was erected, evolutionist or otherwise, cannot and must not be allowed to flourish. Now, what he's talking about when he says that foundation on which scientific methodology and research which is erected, he's talking about the scientific method and using a scientific approach to studying whatever you're studying. He's saying that should not be allowed to be undermined and destroyed, whether it's by anybody, including an evolutionist. He says, in a certain sense, the debate transcends the confrontation between evolutionists and creationists. We now have a debate within the scientific objectivity and ingrained prejudice, between logic and emotion, between fact and fiction. Okay? He's saying, just push the creation individuals and belief out to the side for a moment. Don't even look at that conflict. Just look at the evolutionists themselves and their whole thing, and there's a conflict between logic and emotion, between fact and fiction, between scientific objectivity and ingrained prejudice. So it's evolutionists like him that are complaining about these other evolutionists and what they're doing to the scientific method. He says, in the final analysis, objective scientific logic has to prevail, no matter what the final result is, no matter how many time-honored idols have to be discarded in the process. What he's saying is, if I have to ultimately give up evolution altogether to maintain integrity of my science, then that's what's got to be. He says, after all, it is the duty of science to defend the theory of evolution and to stick by it to the bitter end, no matter what the illogical and unsupported conclusions it offers. He's being sarcastic. And then he says, if in the process of impartial scientific logic they find that creation by outside superintelligence is the solution to our quandary, the quandary being that nothing makes any sense, then let's cut the umbilical cord that tied us down to Darwin for such a long time. It's choking us and holding us back. He says holding us back. He's suggesting it's holding us back from finding the real answer to this whole issue of origins. He's not necessarily saying the answer is creation. He's saying whatever the real answer is, we're being held back by this Darwinian garbage.
Well, there's not too many other choices.
No, not really, except that I think they hold out hope that there is something they haven't thought of yet which will suddenly make sense out of the evolutionary process. The idea of creatures descending one from another.
Not being accountable to God.
Well, but can we expect non-Christians to be functioning in a way in which they put themselves in a position of being accountable to God? Of course we can't expect that. Anyway, I appreciate that guys like this are willing to be this honest.
Yeah.
I don't care, even if they're not willing to be accountable to God. I'm just glad that they're being this honest. He also says every single concept advanced by the theory of evolution and amended thereafter is imaginary, as it is not supported by the scientific established facts of microbiology, fossils, and mathematical probability concepts. Darwin was wrong. And then finally he says the theory of evolution may be the worst mistake made in science. Unquote. Yeah. Here's a guy that I can't begin to pronounce his name. I've only got his first initial K, and his last name is Hsu or Hugh or it's H-S-U. How would you pronounce H-S-U? Sue? Sue. Is this a boy named Sue? Oh. Anyway, he's a geologist at the Geological Institute at Zurich. In an article published in Geology magazine entitled Darwin's Three Mistakes, he said this: "We have had enough of the Darwinian fallacy. It is time we cry, quote, 'The emperor has no clothes,' unquote." Scott M. Hughes, or Hughes, it's H-U-S-E, Ph.D., in his book, The Collapse of Evolution, published in 1983, he is now a believer and a creationist, but he was an evolutionist and an atheist before. Okay? He said this: "Far from being an established fact of science that it is so typically portrayed to be, evolution is in reality an unreasonable and unfounded hypothesis that is riddled with countless scientific fallacies." Unquote. Strong talk, and no doubt that noticing that may have been partly what brought him to the Lord and brought him to become a creationist. We come up with some doozy names. A biologist by the name of Ludwig von Bertalanffy. Bertalanffy. As quoted by Houston Smith, I like that name better, in a book by Houston Smith called Beyond the Postmodern Mind, published in 1982, Bertalanffy, said this, as quoted by Smith. He said, "The fact that a theory so vague, so insufficiently verifiable," in other words, they haven't been able to verify it, "and so far from the criteria otherwise applied in hard science, has become a dogma, can only be explained on sociological grounds." Unquote. H.S. Lipson, that's L-I-P-S-O-N, that's not a misprint or a mispronunciation, professor of physics at the University of Manchester in England, in a paper published in 1980 by the Institute of Physics, said this: "If living matter is not then caused by the interplay of atoms, natural forces, and radiation, how has it, living matter, come into being? There is another theory, now quite out of favor, which is based upon the ideas of Lamarck." Lamarck was an evolutionist. "That if this is Lamarck's idea, that if an organism needs an improvement, it will develop it and transmit it to its progeny." That's a variation on the typical theme of mutation and natural selection, in which changes just occur, and if it's a good one, it gets preserved by the process of natural selection. Lamarck proposed the idea that a creature needed something would happen where it would just develop it. He says, Lipson goes on to say then, "I think we need to go further than this and admit that the only acceptable explanation is creation. I know this is anathema to physicists, as indeed it is to me." You got that? This is not a creationist saying this. It's anathema to him. But he says the only acceptable explanation is creation. But we must not reject a theory that we do not like if the experimental evidence supports it. Unquote. Another guy, George Cocan, Kocan, a science writer and a biologist, in an article published in the Chicago Tribune in April 21st, 1980. The article is called "Evolution Isn't Faith But Theory," said this. Now that title actually implies or would lead you to believe the wrong thing about what he's going to say here. So bear with it. Listen to the quote first, then you'll understand what he means by the title. It says evolution is not faith but theory, because our point from the beginning is it's all faith that isn't, has nothing to do with science. It's just faith. He says it's not faith but theory. Here's what he means. Unfortunately, he says, many scientists and non-scientists have made evolution into a religion, something to be defended against infidels. See, we're the infidels who are banging away at their religion. In my experience, he says, many students of biology, professors and textbook writers included, have been so carried away with the arguments for evolution that they neglect to question it. They preach it. College students, that was not my interjection, that's his words, they preach it. College students, having gone through such a closed system of education, themselves become teachers, entering high schools or to continue the process, using textbooks written by former classmates or former professors. High standards of scholarship and teaching break down. Propaganda and the pursuit of power replace the pursuit of knowledge. Education becomes a fraud. Unquote. Now, what he means by his title, Evolution Isn't Faith But Theory, is most of these people, it is faith, and it isn't a theory that's being tested with real science, and that in any theory, any scientific theory, whether it be evolution or creation in this case, you need to ask yourself hard questions to test your belief system and against the facts. He's saying they're not doing that. They're just holding a belief system, and he's saying evolution isn't faith but theory. He means it shouldn't be treated like a faith. It should be treated like a theory and tested and dealt with. That's what he's saying. But in fact, the point is, it is a religion and it is faith. Dr. Louis Boinard, I think I need, what's his name from Saturday afternoon program? Garrison Keillor to pronounce this for me. It's a French name. He's got that character he does. Anyway, I can't pronounce his name. Dr. Louis Boinard, Bounnoure, is Director of Research at the French National Center for Scientific Research, Director of the Zoological Museum, and the former President of the Biological Society of Strasbourg. This is an uppity guy, okay, and he's an evolutionist. He's what the quote I'm going to read you is quoted by Wilbert Rush. We've quoted him earlier in our study. In an article he wrote, Analysis of So-Called Evidences for Evolution, which he published in the Bible Science Newsletter in 1967 and again in the Advocate magazine in March of 1984. And he quotes Boinard as saying this: evolutionism is a fairy tale for grown-ups. This theory has helped nothing in the progress of science. It's useless. Unquote. I got so many names I can't pronounce. Dr. T.N. Tamizian, a U.S. Atomic Energy Commission physiologist, quoted in the Fresno Bee newspaper, and also by N.J. Mitchell in his book called Evolution and the Emperor's New Clothes, published in 1983, on the title page had this quote from Dr. Tamizian. Here's the quote. Scientists who go about teaching that evolution is a fact of life are great con men, and the story they are telling may be the greatest hoax ever. In explaining evolution, we do not have one iota of fact. Unquote. How many of you have heard of Malcolm Muggeridge? Malcolm Muggeridge is a well-known philosopher and a journalist who formerly was an evolutionist and an atheist. When I first encountered Muggeridge when I was in college and was a philosophy student, God forbid, I don't promote that. I just was dumb. But nevertheless, when I first encountered him, he was one of the great modern-day atheists and arguers against anything of God. In more recent years, somewhere like 15, 20 years ago, supposedly he became a Christian. I say supposedly, I'm not convinced he actually became a Christian, but he at least became something other than an atheist, and he did reject evolution. Anyway, in his series of lectures called his Pascal Lectures, he said this, quote, I, myself, am convinced that the theory of evolution, especially to the extent to which it has been applied, will be one of the great jokes in the history books of the future. Posterity will marvel that so very flimsy and dubious an hypothesis could be accepted with the incredible credulity that it has. Incredible credulity means absolutely incredible, simple acceptance as if it's true when there isn't any support for it. Unquote. I got a couple of Italians to quote from here. They wrote a book together called, this is the Italian name, Dopo Darwin, Critica al Evoluzionismo. Now, I don't know what that means, but some guy translated it into English, and he called it Darwinism Today. Now, I don't know what the real title means, but I suspect Dopo Darwin isn't necessarily complimentary. But anyway, the two authors are G. Sermonti, who is professor of genetics at the University of Perugia, former director of the Genetics Institute of the University of Palermo, and senior editor of the Biology Forum, and his co-author R. Fondi, a paleontologist, have both scientifically rejected macroevolution, and in their book they said the following. The result we believe must be striven for can therefore only be the following. Biology will receive no advantage from following the teachings of Lamarck, Darwin, and the modern hyper-Darwinists. Indeed, it must, as quickly as possible, leave the narrow straits and blind alleys of the evolutionistic myth and resume its journey, that is, science, okay, resume its journey along the open and illuminated paths of tradition. Paths of tradition would be the scientific method again, going back to real science instead of all this garbage. Just about out of time, and I'm just right at the end of this section, so it'll be a good breaking point. The last one I have is a quote from evolutionist G.A. Kirkut, K-E-R-K-U-T, in his 1960 book called Implication of Evolution, in which he exposed in the book the weaknesses and fallacies of the usual evidence that's used to support the evolutionary theory. And in his concluding paragraph in the book, he stated this, quote, there is the theory that all living forms in the world have arisen from a single source, which itself came from an inorganic form. This theory can be called the general theory of evolution, and the evidence that supports it is not sufficiently strong to allow us to consider it as anything more than a working hypothesis. Now, what's a hypothesis? I looked up the dictionary definition of hypothesis. Here are the three definitions given. 1, something assumed because it seems likely to be a true explanation. 2, a proposition assumed as a basis for reasoning, a supposition. 3, a mere assumption or guess. And then they used it in a sentence, your reasoning seems plausible, but it's only a hypothesis. Then I looked up some other things and found the difference between a theory and a hypothesis. A theory implies a larger body of tested evidence and a greater degree of probability. A hypothesis, which he says it's nothing more than a working hypothesis, evolutionary theory, hypothesis designates a merely tentative explanation of the data advanced or adopted provisionally, often as the basis of a theory or a guide to further observation or experiment. And we've talked in our earlier study of all this stuff between the difference between a theory and a model. A theory is something that can be tested, and then you'd find evidence to support it or else throw it out. The hypothesis is even lower level than that. Now, I meant to get in tonight to the whole subject of the necessity of faith, And we will next week and have much interesting discussion on the fact that evolution is all based on faith. And it's necessary to have faith to believe in evolution. We're out of time. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we do thank and praise you for this time we've had looking at these things. We thank you for the